It's 10 o'clock, and I would like to welcome everyone to Henry County Chamber of Commerce, and we represent the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. And my name is Judy McMurtry, and I'm CEO of JM Excel Consultant. And we have with us today Christy Chuning and Dr. Angelise. Did I say it right? Angelise Booker. Okay, so Christy, at this point in time, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Judy. This is Christy Chuning. I am with Central Georgia EMC, and I serve on the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Committee for Henry County Chamber of Commerce. And we've been doing these community dialogues since really early in 2020 after COVID, when we had just started the DEI committee. And so we took our first year and we read really good recommended books on diversity, equity, inclusion. And so we've just kind of morphed into what we're doing now, and just learning what's out there in the DEI space in different areas. And so we would love to thank Kaiser Permanente for being the sponsor of our community dialogues. And we just hope that more people tune in and people get to watch them as they're out on the Henry Chamber website, and you can find us on Facebook as well. So thank you so much, Judy.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Booker. So we have Dr. Booker with us, and she has her PhD. She's the Director of Diversity and Inclusion Initiatives at Mercer University. So you have so many accolades, and I would like you to actually introduce yourself if you don't mind, so that way I don't miss any highlights that you may want to share with the group.
Good morning. Thank you so very much, Ms. McCarthy. Really, what I've done so far with the Office of Diversity and Inclusion as it relates to the Chamber of Commerce, so many activities, so many community dialogues, and I'm just grateful to be part of this community. I will not belabor the point of introducing my accolades, but I would really like to get started with the conversation with Professor Wetherbee, if we could. I know there's some exciting material that I definitely want to cover, but excited to be here and excited to continue the work that we do in Henry County, along with our community partners.
Okay, sounds great. All right, then it's all yours. Introduce Ms. Evey to the group.
Okay, great. Thank you so very much. So I would like to now have the opportunity to introduce my colleague here at Mercer University, Professor Evey Wilson Wetherbee. So Evey is a journalist, an Emmy-nominated filmmaker, and an assistant professor of practice at Mercer University in Georgia. She began as a photojournalist and then fell in love with film and audio. Her work often focuses on the human impact of larger systems. She recently directed and produced an investigative documentary about small towns' fight for clean water against the largest coal-fired plant in the United States. The film Saving Juliet screened at film festivals and has won multiple awards, including the Best Short Documentary at the 2020 American Conservative Film Festival. It is now, Conservation Film Festival. It is now available to view on PBS. Evey was a finalist for the Livingston Award in local reporting for this work, and she most recently produced a podcast called Prison Town, a narrative true crime investigation using one prison in South Georgia as a case study to look at the Georgia Department of Corrections. She was named a 2023-2024 U.S. Rosalind Carter Mental Health Journalism Fellow and is the Benjamin Rothdahl Guarantee for the Mental Health Investigative Journalism Award. Thank you for joining us, Professor Wetherbee, and now we'll get started with our questions.
Dr. Booker, thank you for having me. I'm really grateful to be here.
Amazing, amazing. So if you did not know, today's questions will follow the line about her work in the Prison Town documentary that I just mentioned earlier, and this also on the True Crime Podcast Network. So just so you can hear a little bit more about the background, I'll start with our first question. Could you please, Professor Wetherbee, tell us more about your reporting journey? How did you become aware of the conditions in Georgia's prison system?
Okay, so Prison Town is a podcast that I produced with a colleague of mine, Jessica Szilagyi, and it's a 6-part series that investigates one prison in South Georgia, in Tattnall County, which is about 40 minutes north of Savannah, as a way of looking at what's happening in the larger Georgia Department of Corrections. So we tried to shrink it and only look at one prison, because a lot of really interesting and hard to believe things were happening at this one prison. We use that as a microcosm and a case study to look at the larger system. But I got interested largely because of my work here at Mercer at the Center for Collaborative Journalism. We work with Georgia Public Broadcasting, the Macon Telegraph, 13 WMAZ. So all of our colleagues were deciding what to report on collaboratively. And the Federal Department of Justice announced an investigation into Georgia's prisons. So they had recently done an investigation into Alabama's prisons, and they had announced an investigation into Georgia's prisons for civil rights violations, basically trying to figure out whether or not our citizens that are currently incarcerated are having their civil rights violated. And so we decided to do that investigation. So collaboratively, a lot of the local journalism partners started looking into it in different ways and capacities. And that about a year of that reporting really informed the trends. Like I could see trends because I had spoken to so many people and I had heard stories from so many different prisons. So I knew what was indicative of the rest of the system. So then when I heard this really wild story where the violence, instead of being inside the prison, crossed outside of the prison, I realized, okay, this story is really unique. And I think I can use it to talk about all the things that I've seen in this past year.
Amazing, amazing. And I think you've started to answer question part 2, because you said that there was a pending investigation into the civil rights violation. So could you speak a little bit to, in your opinion, how does this relate to social justice work? And how does this a violation of the civil rights of those individuals that are currently incarcerated or previously incarcerated?
Someone that I interviewed, I thought, put it really well, in that we have a justice system that decides when someone does something wrong, right? So someone has had an infraction, they've committed a crime, something happens, they go through the justice system to then decide their penance or what they have to do to be able to then re-enter into society. And while they are incarcerated, we have 2 kind of big goals. One is to keep them safe as they do their time, right? We have to allow them to be able to finish their time. And then also we have to separate them from the rest of society during that time that we've deemed that they need to do that, right? And the Department of Corrections is having a big problem with both of those things. So what I found in our reporting, a lot of it comes down to understaffing. So you have more than 1,000 inmates at a prison and 4 or 5 corrections officers on duty. There's just no way to protect those inmates, right? There's no way to ensure that they're going to be okay. And then contraband was a really big problem that I started noticing. So for us, contraband cell phones were really big, and a lot of the violence that we found and that we followed was instigated with contraband phones and also drugs, other just items that were not allowed to be inside of a prison that had gotten into a prison illegally and then created this kind of economic structure inside the prison. So those, understaffing and the contraband, and then also just the violence. There was a lot, I think the lack of staffing, the lack of having eyes on people led to there's an uptick in violence, and that's a big part of the federal investigation is that uptick in violence. So, yeah, I mean, there's more problems than that, right? I have a colleague who's phenomenal, Grant Blankenship, who was researching food, are they getting enough food? And if being hungry maybe leads to more violence, or some of these prisons in Georgia don't have air conditioning, right? Or heat. And in the South, that's unbearable. That's unbearably hot. So, yeah, there's a lot of these kind of bigger questions. And this question around understaffing, maybe that's solved with more guards, or maybe that's solved with less people in prison, right? So, trying to figure it, a lot of people have different solutions to these problems. And I think that made my reporting really interesting because I was constantly learning. And I will share that I am particularly interested in prisons because my family's Polish. And when I was in high school, two women that were very close to my family, they were kind of like my aunts, but they're my mom's best friends, were deported to a private prison in South Georgia when I was in high school. And so that experience of being unable to advocate and not having any power led me to be very interested in prisons, particularly in Georgia.
So that's a personal connection for you there as well. And there's so many variables, as you already mentioned, from food insecurities to safety to violence, to this economical structure that's in the prisons because of this illegal contraband. But I do have a question. So how did you conduct your interviews? Were they over the phone? Did you actually go inside the prisons? How did you and your partner do that work before we move on to the next question?
Yeah, so my first kind of entry point before I met Jessica Szilagyi, who I worked on this Prison Town with, this podcast with, I was doing this kind of years worth of reporting. And I was particularly interested, like, how do I get people who don't think about prison to care about prison? And my entry point for that was, we have people that are dying inside prison, due to the violence. And so I was interviewing families who had lost loved ones who were inside of prison at that time. And I was going through the family members. So finding families whose loved one was supposed to get out in a year or 2 years, but rather died inside, and it kind of feels like they're serving a life sentence, right? They'll never come back out. But the interviewing of inmates was tricky. So I had a lot of people reach out to me on contraband phones, and I didn't ethically felt I felt conflicted around that because I didn't want to get anyone in trouble for talking to me. So the way that I figured that out is that I interviewed people who had recently gotten out of prison. So I spoke with a lot of people that had gotten out of prison in the last year. So that informed my reporting. They could talk about kind of what was going on, what was different at these different places. And then I spoke to a lot of people who worked at the prison or who were contractors who serviced the prison. That was a way. And then I was most informed, I think, by the family members. So people who currently have loved ones in and are able to talk to me. And so they can find out information from their loved ones, however they would like to do that. And also they're able to be on like a list to communicate with them. So I kind of went around it largely just because I was very nervous about I was just very nervous. So like we have an email account that people would email, and oftentimes inmates would email us. So we knew that we were like on the right track, but I didn't want to do anything that made me feel like I was stepping over any kind of ethical boundary in that way.
Okay. Can I interrupt for a second? Because we have a question through the chat. Did your research take place during the pandemic, and were vaccines offered to inmates, and were there any COVID deaths during that time?
Yes. So I did not focus on the pandemic. I did start my reporting after the pandemic, but I'm pretty underinformed. So the civil rights violation, the investigation into civil rights wasn't necessarily tied to the impact of the pandemic on the inside. I mean, I've heard some horror stories about it and kind of the fear around it. And yeah, I've heard a lot of those stories, but that wasn't a part of my specific reporting. So I'm not the most informed person to answer that question.
Well, just another question. This is just, so you did your research around the time it was COVID, correct?
Yeah, so the federal investigation was launched 2 years ago in 2021. So I think it was September of 2021 that they launched that investigation. And so that's when I started looking. And I will say, so one of the things that was complicated for me and that I don't know is the something that is bad and hard for people who are serving time. Because of pandemic, a lot of the policies around having their family members visit them were taken away. So a lot of people were unable to see their loved ones. And that made it really difficult to talk home, to call your family members or to see them in person, right? If you have kids, if you're married, if you just want to see your mom, right? Whatever that situation was. So the visitations were one of the first things to go, and that was really stressful and really hard for a lot of people. And something that I had learned in my reporting is that tie between an inmate and their loved ones who are advocating for them on the outside is necessary for the person who's currently in to be able to have a safe space to return home to. They're less likely to go down that same path. It'll help with lower the rates of recidivism, all of that, if you have that support system on the outside. So I spoke with one warden who realized that connection. He was like really trying to have family days and trying to make it easier for his the people in his prison to communicate with their families through legal methods, right?
Right.
But because it's necessary, and I spoke with a lot of loved ones who, because they spoke to their person on the inside, they could say, like, I know that they're off their medication and they need medication, or they're having suicidal thoughts and we need to get them help because this is something that we can treat, we can help them, right? And so having that link to your advocates on the outside is necessary. And I think that was something that was really it was less predictable and stable throughout the pandemic. And I think
That could have heightened everything, the
Yeah.
situation made it
and
even worse.
it's not great. You need to be able to communicate with people on the outside, especially because there's so many problems, right? So you need to have some kind of connection to be able to tell people what's happening on the inside, because oftentimes these are like black boxes, right? And so you need some way to communicate, but ideally it's through like a legal method of some sort.
Of course. So that could have had an impact and really escalated the situation even worse. Okay.
Yeah. And I
So-
also, what I heard too was that you have to have like something to live for, right? You have to have
Right.
something that you're looking forward to. And if like it's seeing your family or talking to your family, or that's something that like gives you purpose, right?
Yes.
So if you take that away from someone, that's really a difficult mental space to be in.
That's true. Okay, Dr. Booker, I'm sorry. Thank you. Go right ahead.
No worries, because that's the perfect segue. When you're talking about being advocates in the mental health component is another variable that is a part of this crisis that we're seeing here. And then of course the pandemic, as we may have assumed, would have exacerbated some of these circumstances for not only the families, but those that are currently serving time. And just to make that connection for our next question, on your podcast, I can't remember which episode it was just right now, but you talked to the family of Joshua Carl Haynes Lester, right? And I just wish you could share a little bit about that particular part of the film and give some insight into that particular part about the family and being able to advocate, because I really saw that connection there with that particular episode.
Okay, so that was it was before I got to the podcast itself. It was a short film that I made about this family. So Carl Haynes Lester was murdered at Central State Prison here in Macon, and he was someone who was supposed to get out. I don't know if it was a year or 14 months after the fact. He was serving a very short sentence and was stabbed in the prison and died. And he left behind a son. So he left behind a sweet boy named Memphis, who I think at the time was 4, if I remember correctly. And so I'm always trying to figure out, how do you get people to care, right? Like, this is something that I think about because it's something that I look at and I research and I report on. But a lot of people maybe don't have that connection, so they just don't think about it that often. Even though, like the economy, like your taxes pay for this, there's all these other things that you're tied to it. But I think a lot of times people don't think about it. So I decided to follow Joshua Carl Haynes Lester's mother, Nancy, as she started to take care of his son. So she was, in her mid-60s, about to be retired. She had like bought a condo and was planning on going scuba diving. And then all of a sudden now she's like the mother figure for a 4-year-old. And so I spent some time with them and got close to them and just wanted to show that. So she did officially adopt him, which is really exciting. And I think beautiful in a lot of ways, but really tragic that he doesn't get to have his dad to raise him in that way. So that was kind of one of those entry points where I was trying to figure out, how do I find a way to just humanize this, right? And I was really thankful that Nancy and Memphis let me into their life. And yeah, they're really, really lovely and beautiful people. So they allowed me in, and it's intense to see a 4-year-old miss their dad, right? Like every time he prays, he's like praying to his dad, who's an angel, he's like trying to have this relationship where they had a little photo of his father by the door. And every time they leave, he says like, goodbye, dad. And every time he comes in, he says, hello, dad. Like, how do you teach a 4-year-old who your dad was, right? Was really kind of, but the masters are phenomenal people. So they let me in. So that was like the first kind of short film that I made trying to get at this issue. And there was a lot of, I interviewed somewhere between 30 and 40 people until I figured out the story that I wanted to follow. So I spoke to a lot of people until I picked that story. And that eventually helped inform when I heard everything that was happening down in Tattnall County at this one prison, Smith State Prison, in this county that had 3 prisons. I knew it was interesting, but I also knew that even though it was kind of interesting from a true crime perspective, it was actually pretty emblematic of everything else that was happening in the Georgia Department of Corrections. So it wasn't just a crazy outlier. It was something that I could use to pull in people. I always try to think, I want to pull in people who like true crime and have them care about prison policy. That was the goal, right? It's really about prison policy, but I wanted people who don't think about that to get interested in it. So yes, so Nancy Masters and her family were a very important step on that journey.
And I love that because the part that I was viewing, you do see the humanization effort that you were trying to make there with the connections with the family, and just seeing how many times she was filling out forms and trying to get more information, as to the cause of death and different things, because again, that is hard for not only a parent, but definitely that of a child who's grieving and just trying to understand how the system works and how to get the best information that they can. And I think, like you said, those people that are connected to true crime, but also want to see a change in our societies, sometimes that human connection bridges that gap for them, and that they're able to advocate in a much greater capacity.
Yes,
because they see it differently. Mm-hmm.
Dr. Booker, that's a good point. So there's like this scene in that film of Nancy Masters at the table with all of this paperwork, and she's trying to figure out what happened to her son, right? So her son was, the Georgia Department of Corrections called her and said that her son had died while being an inmate at Central State Prison. And she was trying to figure out what was happening, but because it was an ongoing investigation and there is a lot of violence that is then backlogged in the courts, largely, I think also because of the pandemic, was backlogged in the courts. The ongoing investigation went on so long, and during that, Georgia Department of Corrections couldn't give her any information. She wasn't able to file a lawsuit against the state. So it's like this kind of like the system that's supposed to protect her in multiple ways crumbled, was unable to help her family.
Yes, because I think so many people like that watch true crime documentaries, or they may watch a fictionalized version like Oz or, Orange is the New Black. They really don't understand some of the nuances that happen within the prison system, because we're watching a show or entertainment value, and they're maybe not seeing the human connection to that, right? But I do want to ask about the suicide rates. So September is Suicide Awareness Month, and according to the AJC, or the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Georgia prisons see unprecedented numbers of suicides and homicides each year. Has your research indicated anything of that nature, or can you shed a little bit of light on that for us?
Yeah, I don't have a specific number, but when an inmate dies, when they're custody of the state at that point, they will tell you how, so that so there's 2 ways to get information from the Georgia Department of Corrections. I can ask a person about it, or I can FOIA, like Freedom of Information Act, request documents of data. And so we would do that. We would ask for anyone who had died while they were serving their time. And you get a cause of death in addition to slightly more information, but not very much. And I would say it felt like at least 40, maybe 50% are undetermined. Every once in a while you'd see suicide. Every once in a while you'd see homicide. And then sometimes it would say natural cause of death. So maybe they were older, right? So they had been, or maybe they've been fighting something chronic for a long time. But the suicide issue is a big issue inside in the prisons. And I think there's also, it's hard for families as well because of the lack of information. It's difficult. What we would do is we would also check the information that was given to us from the Georgia Department of Corrections against the coroner's report. So we would ask if we could see the coroner's report or talk to the coroner, because the coroner might be able to provide information around an undetermined death that maybe was very determined for him or her. So they would be able to tell us a little bit more information. But I'm excited. So this past season of the podcast was entirely on kind of these issues related to understaffing, violence, and contraband. Those were like the three big themes that I followed in this last season. And I just got a grant. I'm a Rosalind Carter Fellow for mental health to focus only on mental health in Georgia's prisons for the next season. So suicide will be a part of that reporting moving forward.
And congratulations on that grant that you received, because I know funding is a big part of any type of investigative journalism, especially if you're going to expand into a podcast or a docuseries, or like you did your short films, right? So why did you choose a podcast as your vehicle to get this information out into the world?
Yeah. And can I give like a short,
Yeah,
a
sure.
short intro to the podcast for people who don't
Of
know? 'Cause
course.
I'm kind of talking around it, but I'd been reporting on the Georgia Department of Corrections for about a year and a half when I read an article where an 88-year-old man was murdered in the middle of the night, and this small town had no clue what had happened to him. It was like shocking. He was this patriarch. He had all these grandkids. He was the town historian. And it was linked back to this inmate who'd used a contraband phone to hire a hitman on the outside of prison to murder a corrections officer that was cracking down on contraband. But the hitman got the wrong person. He killed his neighbor because they had similar trucks. Their houses looked really similar. And so it kind of sent us down this. I knew that there was a lot of violence related to these things in prison. But then to all of a sudden you have it crossing outside of prison, just made for an interesting kind of way of looking at this. And then we followed the people involved in that crime, and it linked back to 3 other crimes that then spread from one prison to another prison. So then we looked at the economic impact of 3 prisons in one county, which is very rare, while following this series of murders as a way to illuminate the Georgia Department of Corrections. So it was very interesting. I promise, if you don't think you like prison policy, you'll be interested in it. So it's called Prison Town. But so we decided to do a podcast. I am Dr. Booker, thank you for sharing my background, but I am a visual journalist by trade, and mostly I make documentary films at this point. And I was filming it to be a documentary film, but we were about a year into the investigation, maybe like 8 months into the investigation. We knew that we were onto something, and the Georgia Bureau of Investigations arrested the warden. So the warden was arrested on RICO charges, which are organized crime charges. And we knew at that point that we needed to make it. The thing that we were making had to be very quick so that we could publish and inform people what was happening. Because it's a pretty big deal for a warden to get arrested.
Yes, it is.
On organized crime charges. And so we pivoted. So we were like, all right, let's get this out as quick as we can. So he got arrested, I think it was February 8th. And by the end of that month, we were launching this weekly podcast to get our information out there. So it was an easier way of synthesizing our information and getting it out quicker. And we're still in the talks of with different outlets trying to figure out, maybe we'll eventually make our film, but it was helpful to disseminate the information as quickly as possible. And it also got us, it was also helpful from like a safety perspective as well, to lean into audio rather than video as well.
And all of that makes such complete sense. I can only imagine being like a fly on your wall, right? I could just see the web of connections that you were making, because I'm into phenomenology too, like telling people's lived experiences in their stories. And I just remember doing my dissertation research. It was like this one variable will lead to another. I could only imagine what that looked like and how exciting it is to be able to follow and track these things back and potentially help solve some issues and concerns, not only for your work, but also for the prison, that maybe they had not made those connections themselves because, like you said, of understaffing, of things of that nature. But I do want to go a little bit more into the podcast and talk about episode 1. So for those of you who have not watched the podcast just yet, or maybe you may be a little bit further along in the podcast, we're going to talk about episode 1, which is titled Fireball. And so it talks about a riot at Smith State Prison on February the 8th, 2023. So this would have been in the same time frame the warden would have been indicted, right?
So February 8th was the day that he got
Day.
it.
Oh, it was the same day. Oh, wow. Talking about breaking news.
Exactly.
So why did you choose that particular prison for the audience who may have not watched the episode or listened to it yet?
Listen to it. Yeah. So the reason we chose, so I'd been doing all this reporting, and when I saw kind of these things that were happening at Smith State Prison, they had pretty high, their death rate was higher than, it might have not been the highest, I can't remember, but it was like one of the highest ones. It is a pretty notorious prison. And it was in the same, it is rare for one county to have more than one state prison. And this one county had 3 state prisons, which is a total anomaly. So everything that is an impact on their emergency services, on their judicial circuits, on just everything, on their tax bracket, and they subsidize their water. There's like all of these economic impacts if you look at this one county having 3 prisons. And it's a rural county. It's a very rural county. So this county was interesting from that kind of the idea of looking at, when you have a prison, how does that impact the county itself? Because we all of a sudden had 3 counties. And then also there was another notorious prison that they closed very quickly. They're I think in the height, kind of when this investigation was announced, this one prison had a lot of things wrong with it, like a lot of bad, a lot of things were coming out of it that made it seem like this was really a place to look at. And so they actually shut that prison down. So then in the course of our reporting, now there's only 2 prisons in this county. But yeah, so basically the information that was coming out of it showed that it was, there was higher rates of violence. We were hearing from people who had just gotten out that was one of the worst places that they'd spent their time if they had moved around from multiple prisons. So we knew that. And then because so many bizarre things were happening, like a corrections officer brought in $29,000 in cash that was taken up at the guard stand. We were like, all right, if someone's bringing in that much money, it can't be used by inmates. So it has to be used by someone who's leaving the prison. There were all of these little things that once we started looking at it, we could see it just felt impossible that like at least someone who worked there had to know what was going on. And so that became kind of this thing that we were really fascinated by.
Okay, I have a quick question too. So, in regards to that, when you said they closed their prison down, what did they do with those inmates? Did they cause the other 2 prisons to become overcrowded because they already had problems?
So they moved everybody, and it was a series, like we interviewed people that had worked there at that time, so corrections officers that were there, because from the outside it felt very abrupt. It was like we're going to close the prison in 2 months. 2 weeks it was closed. It was very fast for something like that to happen. But from the people that we heard on the inside, they had been kind of preparing for it and moving inmates for a long time. So for a few months leading up to that, they were just housing them in other places, kind of like dispersing that population to other prisons across the state. And it's not technically closed. So I think it is. I think it still has a warden. I think they maybe house people that are being transported through the state because it's in the center of the state. it's a little bit ambiguous what the use is, but if you like drive into the parking lot, you will still get talked, like a guard will come talk to you. So I think it's still being used, but just maybe a little bit more ambiguous what it's being used for.
Okay. And I'll ask this other question that's in chat after Dr. Booker finish, towards the end, I'll ask the second question. Okay, Dr. Booker.
Excellent, excellent. So my next question talks about, at Mercer, which we know you're currently a professor, and I know you have class later on today, but at Mercer, we have a slogan that says, we major in changing the world, right? So as a professor, how does your journalism research encapsulate or inspire your students? Do they help with detailing the data? Are they transcribing audio? How does that work?
I am so thankful that I get to be a journalist and teach journalism. It's like the absolute dream job, because I make mistakes and I learn from it, and I come back and I talk to my students about it, or I loop them into things. So sometimes I teach video classes. I teach a lot of classes, but some of them, I also teach video classes, which is my favorite medium. So for example, with my mental health journalism this year that I'm focusing on, my students are going to be interviewing and making short videos about some of the people that don't, there's a lot of people that want to talk to me. And so I'm looping in my students as a way of reaching and capturing those stories, because sometimes it's impossible to do all of it on my own. And one of my students helped edit the podcast. So JC Calvert is really talented, and she helped me on one of the podcast episodes. I try to loop them in, and it also just informs the kind of projects that they pick. So I taught a storytelling for social change class last semester, and my students reported on the Okmulgee National Historic Park, the mounds there's a fight for it to become Macon's or Georgia's first national park. And so they kind of used what I had learned in how to communicate, how do you pick stories, how do you figure out a way to make things interesting to people. And they made a 20-minute long film about the Okmulgee mounds and the fight to preserve it, which is really incredible. So sometimes they are looped into my work working with me, but other times I am trying to teach them kind of what I learned about how I do, or how I pick the stories, how I conduct my interviews to really get people to feel comfortable and to do justice to the story, to make people feel like they're really heard. So all of that informs the things that I teach in my classes. Feel very lucky.
Yes, I can only imagine. I just kind of now want to be a student in one of your classes, because I'm gonna feel like Nancy Drew. Like that might have aged
Exactly
with that one, trying to get the scoop. Murphy Brown. I'm really calling out people now from ages ago, but your work is just so exciting and empowering.
Thank you.
But I just want to talk a little bit now about, a few moments ago, you talked about being able to advocate for individuals, and that goes along with empowerment too. But what information do you have for community liaisons, right? I know this is done through the Henry County Chamber, and we have our listeners or people that are part of it that will see this on Facebook Live. But what can we do as an average citizen if we want to advocate for change, or we want to help to promote some of those solutions that the prison system is looking for, or if we have a relative that may be incarcerated?
Man, I think for people who have loved ones that are incarcerated or are really trying to figure out kind of what to do, there is an amazing group on Facebook called They Have No Voice, and it is run by an activist who, Susan Spark-Burns, who is phenomenal. And I often find that people who need things know what they need. I think it's important to hear from people who are impacted and who know what they need, because they inform my reporting. They should inform the policy that's put into place. And I think Susan Spark-Burns created this incredible community, especially on Facebook, for people to not feel alone, and also to try to figure out how to feel, just how to connect to it. So for people who are very connected to it, inform the investigation, the ongoing federal investigation. There's a way for you to do that, to be able to write the investigators that are doing that. for the Federal Department of Justice, let them know what's happening. It's helpful. It's necessary to know that, for them to know what's really going on. And then I think for advocates on the outside, just being dogged about it. If you have a loved one inside, it's not easy, but continuing to show up and to send, to call the people that need to get called, or to send notification, like just to check on your loved one. I think that's exhausting, but really helpful. And then for people who are not connected, but want to be good citizens, I really, really believe that your local elections matter. I think that's just being informed about your local elections is really helpful, because that will inform budgets, that will inform kind of policies. And so I don't know, I really believe that all politics are local. And for us, so Jessica Salaji and I were working a lot in Tattnall County, this place with these 3 prisons. It's exciting. So when they closed Georgia State Prison, there was this petition to put a mega prison there. So to build a 3rd prison that would be even bigger and even more. And they did a poll in the county, and the county said, we don't want it. We like put it somewhere else. We don't want it. And that's hugely important, right? And it feels, it feels hugely important. But I think, our elected officials, putting pressure on our elected officials to kind of really think critically about these things.
And I think that just goes into like neighborhood and community dynamics, because if we can imagine how much parks and sidewalks influence the vibrancy of a community, how then also maybe even a prison might impact the vibrancy of a community. So I'm glad those were some informed and empowered citizens, right?
And even
just,
even just like with Joshua Carl Haynes Lester, like the absence of our loved ones impacts our community, right? So like that's like these gaps where there should be someone sitting at the table with their family, so I think, all of that impacts it.
All of it. Yes. It takes a community. So we have 2 more questions. And so my next to last question is that congratulations again, but your podcast broke the top 250 of true crime podcasts. What can we expect next?
Yes. So one of the things we talked about, Suicide Prevention Month, there's so many things that I couldn't talk about just for the nature of the storytelling. It was helpful. There were all these things, but we wanted to kind of shrink it and make it a concise story that pulled you through these interesting events, but made you think about these difficult policy decisions. But I couldn't talk about all the issues surrounding mental health. I just couldn't, even though everyone I spoke with had something to share about that. Why either it was like anxiety or medication or just post-traumatic stress from having survived what they survived after they got out. So this next season will look entirely at mental health. So probably it will be out this spring where I'm reporting it, working on it. And I think it will look at Baldwin County is what I'm thinking about. So I don't know for sure yet, but I liked looking at one county. And so I think because of the psychiatric hospital that was there, it might be interesting to look at kind of that impact on why we have such a mental health crisis in our prisons and in our jails. That's the question for the 2nd season.
So you'll be looking at Central State Hospital and then the prison that's connected to it for that system?
Largely, I'm interested in like when we closed Central State Prison, what happened to the people that were housed there, or the people, kind of the population of people that got their services there. There was a push for regional care, which makes sense, to take care of people in their own communities where they're closer to their support systems. But I'm interested now. We have so many people who are in our justice system and our criminal justice system who really have mental health issues. So I'm trying to figure out kind of that. Why do we have so many people that need mental health care, but that are sitting in a county jail?
Understandably so. So for my last question, and this is a quick plug, can you tell our listeners or our viewers where to go to see more about your work? Like what vehicles they can use to see more about your work?
Okay, so Prison Town, this is the podcast that we've been talking about. You can listen to it on an Apple Podcast if you have an iPhone. You can listen to it on Spotify, iHeartRadio. anywhere that you get your podcast at this point, you should be able to listen to it. And it's called Prison Town. So I would love if you listen to it, share it with people, hopefully just have conversations around it, because we had a lot of conversations in reporting it. We were learning a lot and kind of changing how we felt along the way. So yes, that's how you listen to Prison Town. And then the other film that was mentioned, Saving Juliet, is about a town in Monroe County, so not very far away, Juliet, Georgia, and that is on PBS. So yeah.
Perfect.
And then I also report for the Macon newsroom here in Macon a lot. So you might hear me on Georgia Public Broadcasting or at the Macon newsroom.
Okay, that's awesome. Wow, this has been an interesting, informative community dialogue, and you have provided us with so much insight. And
Thank you for having me. I really am so thankful to be included.
oh no, thank you for joining us. I mean, we really need to have the community informed, and we do appreciate with the wealth of knowledge and what you're doing in the community to get this information out to the public, which is extremely important. I have one question from chat. It was about what techniques will you use to gather information from that mental health grant, and what final vehicle will you use to communicate your goals? So will you continue with the podcast, or will you do a documentary like you want to when you start reporting out on the mental health issues and concerns in the prison system?
Thank you. I think I will continue with the podcast, largely because when you work solely in the documentary film world that I do, I'm limited by what people say. So I can only use kind of what came up in my interviews. It's harder to incorporate big data sets or information that people didn't speak about in an interview. So in a podcast, I can write that because I can host it. So I can tell you the things that I want to communicate that I learned from other, that maybe I learned from court records, or I learned from, data records that I got. So I really like the podcast world for this reporting. But I do record most of my interviews on video. I have an Instagram, like we have an Instagram for Prison Town podcast on Instagram, and we will kind of disseminate short video clips as a way of reaching people in the social media space and having them be able to find us there. So yes. And then in terms of interviewing, I usually cast a very broad net on these big projects, and I talk to a lot of people because it takes me a while to figure out the trends that most people will talk about. So I'm learning a lot through the mental health space. I started the interviews and I'm learning a lot. And some people's experiences are very unique. Other people's experiences, like it's kind of feels like an echo of someone else's. And those are the ones that I'm usually tend to try to focus on, the ones that it seems like there's something that could change about the system so that those people will have different experiences.
Okay. Well, that's very, wow. I mean, hats off to you. Let's put it that way.
Thank you so much. I really
The work
appreciate
you're
it.
doing is extremely important to all of us. And we appreciate, just even listening to what you shared with us today. So hopefully this will make an impact and will reach more people with the community dialogue. And
I appreciate it.
yes, through the business world as well, because the business need to be aware of it as well. Because Second Chance, I know Georgia has a program called Second Chance. And that's important to understand what's going on and give people a second chance so we don't have them go back to the prison system, and we will, be able to prevent this from happening that way. So we can all do our part. And is all I'm saying with that. Okay. So
yeah.
Yes, you have anything else you want to share, Evey?
Yeah, so when I was like in my early 20s, I worked on this Ban the Box campaign around people with criminal records having a chance to explain their criminal record in a job interview rather than just checking a box and then that application going over to the side and them never having a chance to share. So I think that idea of allowing people to share their stories, allowing people to kind of say, I've learned from that, or this, this is why I was in that situation, or this is what happened. So I really appreciate that. I think that the business world has a huge capacity to change and have positive impact in this space.
Absolutely. So with that said, we know we want to be conscious of your time as well. We do appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule. So Barbara, do we have any questions on Facebook? I was just gonna see if she's gonna respond. And if not, then we will thank Kaiser Permanente for sponsoring the community dialogue for Henry County Chamber of Commerce, the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. No questions. Awesome. Evey, thank you, Professor Evey. You have been
Thank
amazing.
you so much.
I appreciate you. Thank you, Christy. Hey, Christy, you have any questions before we say goodbye?
No, I just did want to say though, we do have a lot of employers out there that will look at people above for what their record is and give those second chances. And if you're not doing that as an employer, get with the Henry Chamber of Commerce and we can get you the information about those programs. And because there are people that are coming out of the prison system that can fill those positions that you're looking to fill. And the second chances are needed. So thank you guys very much for coming on the show.
Oh, 1 second. Somebody has a question. Madison Barry, can we get the contact information for the professor?
Sure, yeah.
Okay.
The best way to contact me is through my Mercer email, which is Wilson, WILSON_EW @mercer.edu.
Okay.
If anyone wants to talk to me about anything related to the prison system or mental health in jails or prisons, I'm more than open.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm just trying to put it in the chat so that way they can be able to see it.
She put it in there.
Oh, she did?
I just did it to the host and panelists. Let me send it to everybody.
Oh,
Let me
okay,
see.
perfect.
I think I can only do host and panelists, so you might have to do that. Sorry.
Oh, okay, no problem.
Well, Professor Wetherbee, I just want to say thank you for spending the morning with me. And don't be surprised if you see me in your class sometime soon.
I hope I do.
This is excellent.
Okay, this is excellent. Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Booker. We appreciate you
welcome.
joining us too. So with that said, we want to just say, enjoy your class today. I know it's going to
Thank
be
you so
exciting
much.
after this information. Okay, thank you everyone for joining us. We'll see you next month. Okay, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.